A lot of people, especially conservative people today, would say things have gotten really bad and they're getting worse and worse as we watch the news and things like this. And so from a conservative point of view, the question is, what went wrong?
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saroof, and I'm joined today by Father John Strickland, who will be another faculty member coming to our honors conference this summer at our headquarters at ISI. Welcome, Father Strickland.
Hello, Tom. Nice to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me.
This is my first introduction to you. Johnny, our president, is familiar with your work, but I am not, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you and getting to know you more, and almost simultaneously interviewing you. But to start with, as we do with many of our guests, I'd love to hear more from you about who you are, where you come from, things that you've done throughout your career, obviously your priesthood, things of that sort.
Well, thank you. Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm currently a priest at St. Elizabeth, the New Martyr Orthodox Church in Paulsbo, Washington. That's located on the Kitsap Peninsula opposite Seattle, about an hour and a half away by ferry ride. And it's a beautiful place to live. I've been here about 10 years now, the pastor of the church, and that's my main work and that's my main commitment. But on the side, I teach, and I've written books in the past 5-6 years, I guess it was, that were kind of a culmination of a long period in my life when I was teaching college history. After getting my PhD in about 2000, I was teaching wherever I went, and was trained in modern European history and especially Russian history. My dissertation that I published was called "The Making of Holy Russia." It's a study of the Orthodox Church and Russian nationalism in Russia before the revolution, which is a topic that's kind of perennial, especially these days with a war going on, and the place of Orthodox Christianity and the cultural heritage, political identity of Russia and Ukraine. From there, I went on to write a 4-volume history of the West called Paradise and Utopia, The Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was, and it's broken into 4 volumes. Each volume covers a period that I characterize with a particular theme. The first volume is on the First Millennium, from Pentecost to the Great Schism. The Great Schism, of course, dividing Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, East and West, or West and East, I guess, respectively. And that one was called the Age of Paradise. Next volume is a study of the period that grows out of that great division, that great schism, from the rise of the papacy and all the what people usually call the Middle Ages up through the Protestant Reformation. Age of Division is what that's called. Next was a study of the rise of secular humanism and its transformation of Western culture, formerly a culture grounded in Christianity. And I call this culture throughout, this civilization throughout Christendom, but now a secular form of Christendom, especially in the West. I call that the Age of Utopia. It covers the period from the Renaissance to the Russian Revolution. And the final volume, just finished about a year ago now, is the Age of Nihilism, where I pick up the narrative with Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Wagner and his operas, talk a lot about Dostoevsky, and the coming of the 20th century. And that takes us all the way up to the culture wars, which is the last kind of big event I talk about in the history of the rise and fall of what the West once was. So the argument of the whole series is that we live in a society today that's really broken up by a lot of crises, especially moral and cultural crises, political crises. A lot of people, especially conservative people today, would say things have gotten really bad and they're getting worse and worse as we watch the news and things like this. And so from a conservative point of view, the question is, what went wrong? What went wrong? And so my effort as an Orthodox Christian, I converted to Orthodox Christianity from Protestantism way back in the 90s. After living in Russia for a couple of years, I decided to convert to Orthodoxy while living there. And And my effort in this project is to take the reader back into the deep past, as I call it, to understand where we are today. A lot of people today will look at recent developments. Maybe it's transhumanism or something like that. They'll go back to the 60s and 70s and look at the sexual revolution. They may go back further and look at the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century. They may look at the Protestant Reformation or the rise of nominalism in the Roman Catholic Church with scholasticism in the late Middle Ages. But as an Orthodox Christian, I think it's much, those are all very valuable and important things to do, and I do them in my books. But for me, it's going back to what I call the deep past, the first millennium of this civilization and its culture that we live in, the West. And to remember that there was a whole millennium, that's half of the history of the civilization we live within, a whole millennium when the Christianity was united, East and West. There was no radical distinction between an Eastern Christendom and a Western Christendom as there was after the Great Schism, the Great Division. And so my project is to, especially starting with that book called The Age of Paradise, is to lay out a vision of the West that is centered upon the first millennium, and then to take up the history from there to see how we got to where we are today, and to offer some suggestions on how, by returning to the culture and civilization of the West during its first millennium, we might have some answers to what we're dealing with today.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Well, right before we started recording, you said it would be hard to cram all of this into 35 or 45 minutes, and now I see why. But before we even talk anything intellectually, I'm just very curious how an Orthodox community came to be over across the Puget Sound in Washington State. I'm from the East Coast, so my understanding of the geography is not out west is not particularly good. But if I understand it correctly, that's on a very large island that you're on. So do you have a very large community, or is it something that's more small, but there nonetheless?
Well, first of all, Orthodox parishes tend to be small. Ancient classical Hagia Sophia in Constantinople is the exception. Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow is the exception. So parishes tend to be pretty small in the Orthodox tradition. In the Orthodox tradition in America, certainly. Our congregation probably has about 100 people on the books. Smaller number show up on a Sunday typically, but that's kind of the size of our community. We always seem to be growing. We have lots of catechumens, about a dozen catechumens ready for baptism at Easter, or Pascha we call it, this year. A lot of people have moved away from this area because of high prices in real estate and political culture and stuff like that. So we've lost a lot of good families to the Midwest and the South in the past few years. But but we're a relatively small parish, and we were planted about 20 years ago, before my time here, but about 20 years ago, by a cathedral, Orthodox cathedral in Seattle. And so Seattle was kind of our home base, and then once we grew large enough people were living here in the Kitsap Peninsula. By the way, it's a peninsula, not an island. I just mentioned that. There are a lot of islands here, but this one's a peninsula. And so they started this parish. It's a really beautiful little church we have here right next to a graveyard. It's in a rural, forested area of the county. It's a really nice little place to be.
Sounds beautiful. Well, there's 2,000 years of history to cover, and I'm sure we won't get to all of it, but starting, I guess, from the beginning, you start with Pentecost. So Christ has ascended. The apostles are waiting for what to do next. They're not sure where to go, and then the Holy Spirit comes down upon them. I'm curious, starting there, but that's the beginning of the church and sort of its missionary character, but simultaneously with that, there's also the pagan world, and then there's the existing Jewish world. So how does this early Christian period fit into both, actually, not just the Greeks, but also the more, probably at this point, more importantly, is the Romans and the Jews who are existing in the first century alongside this new Christian church?
Yeah. Well, so in the book, I spend a lot of time talking about cosmology, an understanding of what the world, the cosmos is. World in Greek is cosmos. And also anthropology, understanding what the human being, anthropos in Greek, is. So I think that it's helpful to use models of civilization to explore this. And so I have a model of civilization I call Christendom. And this is defined by me as a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world, or cosmos. A civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world. So in other words, for Christendom then, as a civilization with a supporting culture, it's grounded in the gospel. It's grounded in what starts at Pentecost. And kind of an alternative model for civilization is what I call pagandom. I mean, I'm not making these words up, obviously, but I'm just using that word pagandom as a contrast to Christendom. And in pagandom, I talk about how the existing state of the world, the cosmos in the time of Pentecost was shaped by paganism, pagan values, pagan beliefs. And the Roman and Greek culture were, of course, really big there. I don't spend a lot of time talking about, you mentioned Jewish culture. I really don't, I don't think I had the time to really get into that much. But I talk about these two alternative civilizations with their supporting cultures, and really much more the first than pagandom itself. I just kind of leave that behind as I move forward. So from Pentecost, Tom, what I argue in the Age of Paradise, which is a study of a whole 1,000 years at the First Millennium of Christendom, is that the West emerged from Christendom before there was a West. We're really into what is the West and how to define the West and heal the West and advance the West and defend the West and all this kind of stuff. But there was a time when there was no West.
Right.
There was only Christendom. That's my argument, that the West is the product of Christendom. Christendom as it was shaped in the first millennium. And so what I try to do then in the opening is trace how from Pentecost forward the church shaped the cosmos around it, in a variety of ways. And one of the most important things that I argue in my book is that we have to understand Christianity, what I call traditional Christianity, throughout. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I consider this to be basically orthodoxy, but a Roman Catholic or Protestant, I'm writing for them as well, and so I want to have something that's flexible and can be used and understood by a variety of people.
Right.
But what I argue is that traditional Christianity, what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, maybe, this is something that had a cosmic effect. It had a cosmological character. And so I isolate 4 features of what I consider to be the Christianity of the early church, found even on the day of Pentecost, that shaped the cosmos as the church entered into this world and transformed it into Christendom, from pagandom to Christendom. And these include things like doctrinal integrity, how important real, authentic doctrinal integrity is to Christendom in its healthiest sense. A great book published recently that documents in America how the culture of America has gone so poorly in the past 50 years or so, as Ross Douthat's book Bad Religion.
Great book.
Where he talks about, what's that?
Great book.
It is a great book. I quote it in The Age of Nihilism extensively. I really enjoyed reading it, and really it articulated so many of the, the concerns and interests I had. So I think what his argument is that, at least in the past 50 years, we've seen, he would maybe not say it this way exactly, but I would say doctrinal integrity has really collapsed. And so I put that as one of the most important features of early Christendom, doctrinal integrity. Then I move on from there in the opening of the book to emphasize how important also is the experience by Christians of being able to participate in the life of God, what I call divine participation. That the human being, the anthropos, remember this is partly about anthropology, the anthropos, the human being, is made in the image and likeness of God, and then because of the incarnation, I present Pentecost as the fulfillment of the incarnation. Because of the incarnation, God becomes human, and humanity now can participate in divinity, can experience the life of God through Jesus Christ sacramentally. And that brings a third element that I say is that I consider very important in the formation of a healthy Christendom, and that is heavenly imminence. Heavenly imminence. There are different ways of speaking about this. I think a more common one today is re-enchantment. Like the idea is that secularization in the modern world, Max Weber talked about this, for instance, has disenchanted the world, made the world no longer something filled with divine presence and divine experience, and the sacraments and liturgy and miracles and things like this have all been displaced and eliminated in the modern cosmology, in a secular cosmology. So what I bring a lot of attention to is the fact, and there's no question about it, that the experience of the early church was one in which wonders were constant. Read the book of the Acts of the Apostles. They're all over the place, happening everywhere. That the Old Testament records that as well, for that matter. And so heavenly imminence, the fact that heaven is on earth, is imminent in this cosmos, in this creation, really important for understanding how a healthy Christendom, a healthy West could be formed with a sense of God's presence. I'll pick that up very emphatically when we come in my third volume to the Age of Utopia and the rise of secular humanism, and how that was a departure, a radical departure from heavenly imminence. And then the fourth and final key feature that I talk about in Age of Paradise, about a healthy Christendom from Pentecost forward, is the importance of a spiritual transformation. That the world, the cosmos, and the anthropos, man, human being, male, female, within the cosmos, sometimes called by the fathers of the church the microcosmos. Man is like the little world, kind of recapitulating the whole creation of God within himself as the steward of this creation. And now, because of the incarnation, filled, as he participates in the sacramental life of the early church, filled with the presence of divinity, the presence of the Holy Spirit. Well, spiritual transformation now occurs as heaven fills the world with its values rather than and experiences, rather than a purely secular one. So I think these four elements then are really important in understanding how Christendom got off to a start and how Christendom flourished in the centuries that followed Pentecost. And before Christianity even became legal, Christendom was already in place in the world. That's one of another argument I make, is it wasn't the conversion of Emperor Constantine that founded Christendom. A lot of people will say that. That's not, in my opinion, true at all. Christendom was there from Pentecost forward.
Okay, that makes sense. I want to pick up specifically on the theme of heavenly imminence, because as you were later saying about how in your third volume, the Age of Humanism juxtaposes or inverts this idea. I mean, I'm familiar with Eric Voegelin's phrase from Science, Politics, and Gnosticism, and of his criticism of people who have a tendency for immanentizing the eschaton, or literally trying to create utopia or create heaven on earth here and now. Mm-hmm. What's the distinction or the difference between a Pentecostal heavenly idea, understanding of heavenly imminence, and this sort of secular humanist utopian version that Voegelin criticizes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a great question, Tom. I think it really it shows up kind of everywhere in my 4 volumes, but especially in the opening of Age of Utopia. Well, so what I see happening in the history as I studied it was that you have a very solid conviction that heaven is present in this earth in the first millennium. This can't be denied. This can't be argued. Well-known scholars of Western Christendom, like Peter Brown, have made it clear, the rise of Western Christendom, that it was a world of marvels that was inhabited by the early Christians in the West and certainly in the East as well. And then, of course, when we talk about, say, the Renaissance and what goes on in the Renaissance, and then especially in the Enlightenment, so-called afterward, I never use the word Enlightenment without saying so-called, because for me, in many ways, the Enlightenment was, as I call it in the Age of Utopia, a benightenment of the West. As a Christian, I believe strongly that light is divine and heavenly,
Right.
and not of this world, that the world is transformed and illuminated by the light from heaven, and that the Enlightenment, by basically appropriating that photic imagery or metaphor and then inverting it so that now worldly things are light and heavenly things are superstition to be displaced and eliminated from the West, from its culture, that can only be understood as an act of benightenment. But anyway, that's not really what we're talking about right now, maybe indirectly. But how this heavenly imminence, to your question, manifested itself was in the transformation of the human experience within the life of the church, especially that life of the church that was centered upon liturgy or worship and sacramental communion with God. So to take one example, the Eucharistic assembly that occurred every Sunday, we call it today, although most languages are a lot more indicative of Christendom than the English language. Most languages will call it, of course, some form of Lord's Day in Latin, in Greek. The Russian language even has it called the Day of the Resurrection,
Well,
the first day of the week, the day on which Jesus rose from the dead and transformed the cosmos because of that. Well, this assembly of Christians sacramentally and liturgically on the Lord's Day was an act of transformation by which sacramentally they participated in divinity. They participated in their understanding of the body and blood of Christ at the Mass in the West, or the Divine Liturgy in the East. With time, that's what these services become known as. And then the architecture and the arts become designed around the experience of heavenly imminence. So, for instance, I mean, this is especially strong in the East, where you find, like, once the great new capital of New Rome or Constantinople is built, cathedrals like Hagia Sophia, founded by Emperor Justinian, have a huge central dome over the main area where the Christians stand in the church. And those Christians stand under that dome, the dome representing heaven on earth. If you go out into a field at night, you look up and you see stars in the sky, it feels like you're under a dome. Heaven looks like a dome. And so that symbolism was introduced by the Christians early on in their worship to emphasize heaven on earth, that this world has been transformed by the heavenly imminence that Christian worship brings. Other good examples from the liturgy of the early church are the practice of orientation. A lot of listeners right now, I bet, I've taught college for so many years. I always challenge my students with this question, is like, what does orientation mean? And they think, oh, it's like freshman orientation. I learn like how to get around campus and where to go if I have things or job orientation or something like this. You think of the word, it's actually based obviously on the word orient. What's the orient? Well, that's a form of the Latin word oriens, which means east. It's all it means. If you go to the Orient, you go to India or Japan or China or something like that. Orientation is to literally face east, eastward, to have an eastward disposition. And that's part of the early Christian culture. That's the language or vocabulary of early Christian architecture, which was oriented toward the east. Why? Because that's where paradise was located. Book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden is planted in the east. It's from the east, according to Malachi, the prophet, about the Messiah, that the Messiah will come like the sun, S-U-N, of righteousness. Then Jesus himself uses eastward symbolism. He says in I think it's Matthew's gospel, that the Son of Man will come at the end of time like lightning from the east. And so the early fathers of the church, I mean, Basil the Great's an example, always emphasize we need to face eastward when we worship, because that's a symbol of our heavenly homeland. That's a symbol of heaven. But it doesn't mean like we don't have any place here. Here, the liturgical assembly, because of the incarnation, has now been transformed by the presence of heaven. And so our eastward orientation in worship, just like standing underneath a central dome, our eastward orientation, which is wonderfully captured by the Western pattern of church architecture called the basilica, is a linear facing the east, where the altar table is located, from which the consecrated Eucharist is brought to the people by the priest to the people to commune them in heaven, in an experience of heaven on earth. So this is all very much developed, elaborated, extended, celebrated in the Christendom of the First Millennium. But what happens, and again, back to your question, I think your question was, how does it become secularized and become a utopia? Paradise becomes utopia, it's built right into the title of my book series, when a pessimism sets in, which I see setting in during the so-called Middle Ages, another term I don't like using. I think it's meaningless and actually counter-Christian. The term Middle Ages suggests that a time when Christianity flourished was a time of just waiting for something else to come, a middle time to wait.
Passing over.
Exactly, yeah, the good classical age. What
do you prefer for, instead of medieval? Do you prefer medieval rather than Middle Ages, or?
I tend to do well. There's two models of measuring time that I favor in the book. One is like a two-part. One is ancient and modern, because we can't get away from modern. There's something about modernity, and that's secularity, being secular-minded, right? And the Age of Utopia talks about the origin of that. The other is being heavenly-minded, and the Age of Paradise talks about the formation of a heavenly-minded West. But anyway, after the Great Schism, and especially in the West, a pessimism sets in. This isn't the place to go into all the details. I've been interviewed by people, and some of your listeners might be able to find stuff online about more detail here. But I think like just one little example is the astonishing iconography or painting of Christ in his suffering, crucified experience that begins really to show up strongly toward the end of the Middle Ages in the West. I'm thinking about the Isenheim altarpiece, for instance, one of the most visually stunning images of Christ in agony, of broken bones and agony and just blood and wounds and things like this. Now, this was designed in the piety of that time to try to stir people to repentance. Repentance is a very healthy thing in my narrative. I actually talk about it in the first volume quite a lot. But the repentance now is more of a reflection on one's own misery as a sinner, one's own role in causing Jesus to undergo this suffering and pain. And more becomes associated with models of salvation that require a long period of suffering after dying before one enters paradise. And that whole, I call it anthropological pessimism, contrasts strongly with the anthropological optimism of the incarnation and the divine participation and the heavenly imminence of that first millennium. Once that pessimism sets in, it becomes oppressive. And for people living in the West and shaped by the transformational imperative, the imperative to see this world transformed, formerly in a heavenly way. Now, since that heavenly way seems blocked, there's a reorientation. One might call it a disorientation away from paradise toward the world, the spiritually untransformed world, the seculum, as St. Augustine called it, the world for its own sake. And one of the earliest people to do this, and you can trace it all happening in his life work in the 14th century, is Petrarch, Francesco Petrarch, father of humanism.
Right.
And beyond him, you see more and more an emphasis upon this world as an end in itself, rather than a cosmos filled with heavenly presence. And that is the beginning of utopia, and creating of the effort to try to create a perfect world. Lasts for about 400 years, and then Nietzsche's one of the early prophets against it, and then modernism in the arts, and finally World War I shatter utopia and the belief that we can create a perfectly secular world.
So if I've got it right, then the reason or the criticism of utopia is not only that it's secular or rejects Christianity or rejects theology,
transcendence,
but also that the reason you would not want to try to immanentize the eschaton is because it's, in a sense, it's already here in its transformation through Christianity. And so that's something that needs protection rather than assuming that it's something far out and that we can create it. It's actually already amongst us, and we've just stopped paying attention to it.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, I think so, Tom. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear what you think about, I've heard it referred to as the Hellenization thesis, but the idea that Greek philosophy and I think in some respects Roman statecraft or Roman law is incorporated into Christianity, or is not in full, in part. There are limitations to this, but and maybe this is more of a Catholic thing than something Orthodox. But the idea that, I think we can see this with St. Augustine, Marius Victorinus, Origen, even St. Athanasius. They're using these sort of Neoplatonic philosophy, which would be antecedent to Pentecost and the sort of Christian transformation that creates the West, as you're putting it. And then, of course, I think the high watermark of this would be with St. Thomas Aquinas, incorporating Aristotle's various taxonomies, typologies, definitions, and his worldview, and showing how it coheres with, in large part, and that Christianity perfects Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy. I'm wondering what you take of that general thesis as it's presented in scholarship and whatnot.
Yeah, and that's largely, as you mentioned, a very much of a Western narrative, a Western focus of attention. And Western development. I think, so in the Age of Paradise, I have, after the conversion of Constantine, so Constantine lived in the early 4th century, so he, of course, converts to Christianity, then he legalizes Christianity, and so Christianity now begins to flourish in what's now called Byzantium. And now you have a state which really is a continuation of ancient Rome, but now it's been Christianized, at least at some level. And so the question is, how legitimate is that from a Christian point of view? At least that's one question that can be raised. And something, I don't know if you'd like to talk about that specifically.
Sure.
But okay, well, so I think I isolate two distinct East-West views of this. One I call the Eusebian view, based on the work of a Eastern bishop named Eusebius of Caesarea.
Yes.
And he wrote a famous history of the church. He's kind of seen as the father of church historiography, although I strongly argue it's St. Luke the Evangelist who's the father of church historiography. But Eusebius did write a wonderful history of the church in the time of Constantine, which shows the church's history up to Constantine's conversion. And he had lived through that conversion, like so many people, with great astonishment at how the church went from the great persecution under Diocletian, Constantine's most immediate and important predecessor, a pagan persecutor of Christians, to one in which the emperor was now a Christian himself and defending and protecting Christians. And so for Eusebius, it's a very optimistic and affirmative cosmology, which we see in him. And again, I think that that's very typical of the Greek East as compared and contrasted to the Latin West. There are other areas we can see where there's a kind of an optimism in the East and a kind of a tendency toward pessimism in the West. You can see this in the contrast between other Eastern fathers. Basil the Great, for instance, writes a lot about the human condition. Other people like John Chrysostom talk about marriage in a very affirmative, positive way. Mm-hmm. Whereas you see in the West, there's one tremendous titan of theology, and that's Augustine. And there's not the diversity of, various theologians as you have in the Greek East. Augustine really dominates in the whole field of theology for so long in the West. And he had a much more pessimistic view of things. You can pick this up in the Confessions, but his most famous work, The City of God, is the fullest and most sophisticated account of this, where he sees two distinct bodies or communities: the city of man, which is living through life in this world and corrupted by all the worldly lusts and passions that this world has, and the city of God, which includes the church now and also the church eternally, and now it's living through this world and trying to, as best it can, keep itself untainted by the world. So you get this really sharp distinction, almost a dualism, a cosmological dualism in Augustine. Now that dualism is grounded in St. Paul's points about life in this world. I mean, the gospel is full of accounts of the dangers of this world and how Christians are not of this world. But if you look at the Gospel of John, and I explore this a little bit in the Age of Paradise, while Jesus in something like John 15 says, if the world hated me, it'll hate you too. So get ready. You have no place in this world. Hebrews says we have no continuing permanent place in this world, this city. But John's Gospel also says, famously in 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave to it his only begotten Son. So God loves the world, and if a Christian is going to participate in the life of God, as a Christian's called to do, a Christian is going to also love the world, not become corrupted by the world in that Augustinian sense or Pauline sense, but love the world and seek to transform the world. And here we have Eusebius seeing Constantine's conversion stirred up with a great anticipation and optimism about what Christian statecraft can do. And so what you find, I think, in the East, Tom, is something rather distinct from the West, where the West begins to, yes, appropriate and acquire and assimilate a lot of different concepts from the pagan inheritance in very limited and carefully distinguished ways. But in the East, there's less concern with that. And I think we just don't have that story told in the East as much as we do in the West. And I think, this book series is not really a history of Christian statecraft. So I don't get into that as much as like a theoretician would probably like me to get into that. But I do try to take notice of basic patterns of approaching statecraft, if that's behind the question you're just asking. And in the East, there's a sense that a Christian ruler really participates in the heavenly imminence, that heaven is present in the rule of a good Christian ruler. Not to say that ruler is not a sinner, not to say most of government is usually violent and nasty, the way Augustine suggested, but nevertheless that there is good to be found in Christian statecraft, and that's to be supported and celebrated and seen, like the liturgy even, like Christian marriage, which formerly had just been a worldly institution, now becomes a sacramental institution.
Right.
So the emperors of Byzantium are being sacramentally anointed to rule the cosmos that the church inhabits and transforms spiritually.
Gotcha. And this is my education coming through, because I mean, I took a class, Christian Faith and Greek Philosophy, with a Jesuit priest, Arthur Madigan, great man. And we studied this Hellenization thesis. This was the theme by which he organized the class. So we would read Greek philosophy, specifically of the post-Christian, or the be after Christ comes. So this is not, we're not reading Plato and then reading it into Augustine. Though Plato was read by Augustine, but the strains of like Middle Platonism and then Neoplatonism that come out in the 100s, 200s, 300s AD, and then we'd read church fathers like John Chrysostom, Saint Basil, Saint Athanasius. I read on the Incarnation. Loved it. But for me, at least, or the way I kind of saw it was, he was, I guess, optimistic, or maybe he was just a happy man. I don't know. But for him, the fusion or the dialogue between faith and reason was not necessarily something to be pessimistic about, the way that Augustine sees a sort of pessimism. And I do agree with you on that assessment. It certainly is the case. He's much more pessimistic, or he has a much more sense of man's fallenness than either Greek philosophers just in general, or maybe other Christian thinkers in that period.
Yeah.
But that this dialogue between faith and reason, Athens and Jerusalem, rather than Tertullian's view and maybe even Paul's view that we have to be very careful with philosophy, should maybe stay away from it. There's this sort of harmony, or at least in a limited sense, again, Hellenization is a good thing, or some cause for joy of seeing both the Incarnation and the Christianity of the book, the people of the book, but also the book of nature and of philosophy, and our ability to see God in creation in that way.
Yeah, wasn't it von Harnack about a century ago who talked about the Hellenization of Christianity, how Christianity was appropriated by Hellenists, philosophers, the culture of, especially the Greeks, the Neoplatonists, and it got kind of transformed from what it wasn't before that. An Orthodox scholar that I admire quite a lot of the 20th century, George Florovsky, said, no, that's not right. Hellenism was Christianized. It wasn't that Christianity was Hellenized, it was that Hellenism was Christianized.
Yeah, I've heard that. We didn't study the Christianization thesis, but that was the sort of flip side of the argument that Father Madigan also shared with us. I'd be curious to delve a little bit deeper with you into an Orthodox political theology, because you touched on this phrase, my kingdom is not of this world. That's from Christ. And then there's also I think it's in Matthew's gospel, that we ought to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God's what is God's. And so there's this idea of two kingdoms that they have to intersect in some way. They're not two separate kingdoms. But from the Orthodox perspective, if we could characterize the Orthodox as having one perspective, maybe that's fallacious, but what are some of the principles of Christian statecraft, thinking of our orientation ultimately towards the heavenly kingdom, but then also the duties of any statesman in the political realm here on earth, while we're on earth?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's hard not to see some contrast there, I think, Tom. Historically, I mean, it was the West that, in that Augustinian mode, did such a good job of clarifying the boundary, between this world and the kingdom of heaven. I mean, the famous confrontation made by against Theodosius, right? Yeah, Theodosius, when Ambrose of Milan refuses to commune Theodosius after Theodosius has massacred a bunch of people in Corinth, Emperor Theodosius massacring a civilian population, and Ambrose of Milan says, you can't do that, you're a Christian ruler. That's an amazing thing. Just by the way, I don't think this is really what you wanted to talk about, but you talk about a different civilization of heavenly transformation. You already saw this in King David's rule when he's confronted by Nathan, the prophet, and he repents of his time with Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah. But it's only in Christendom that you see the breaking up of this pagan model of the ruler is it, and the ruler says what happens, and whatever the ruler does, sometimes the ruler is even divine, as in late and decadent Roman pagandom. The ruler is even a god, and you just don't have that. Now you have the prophetic voice of the church using the gospel of Jesus Christ to confront the ruler and set boundaries around the ruler. And back to what we're talking about, East-West distinctions here. The West does a better job of that than the East. The Roman Catholic Church will, after the Great Schism, have popes that will confront rulers and say, you can't do what you're doing. I'll excommunicate you if you don't change your behavior. That's a much more in-your-face kind of confrontational model of Christian statecraft. Again, very Augustinian in this clear distinction between the two kingdoms. In the East, you don't get that. You don't get that. And certainly as an Orthodox Christian of the West, I'm as West as you can get. Some people say Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox or something. I'm Western Orthodox in the sense that I live about as far west on the globe as you can get here on the Pacific coast. But certainly as someone of the West, I really admire that and appreciate that. And the East, the record of the East was in that Eusebian mode is to kind of just celebrate the Christian ruler and not really to challenge him or her, even though there was plenty of stuff to challenge in the history of Byzantine statecraft or Russian statecraft later on, things like that. And that prophetic confrontation of the bishops or the gospel to power is not found nearly so much in the East as in the West. That's an interesting distinction. But I think I've drifted a little bit away from your question, which was, I'm sorry, if you could just remind me, maybe I can speak to it more directly.
What's an Orthodox political theology? So if the West has this distinction between church and state, with the church, and then certainly through the history of at least Western Christendom, is putting strong constraints on the political power of rulers, while also at the papacy over time developing into a political and temporal as well as spiritual power in its own right. And if the East is more focused on celebrating the ruler, or sort of in this Eusebian mode, what does that look like in terms of I guess political philosophy, or that's why I use the word political theology.
Yeah. Well, of course, there's a lot less political theology generated in the East. The West has a much more strong, vigorous philosophical tradition, especially around with scholasticism arising, and then in the modern period. I think the answer to your question is that in the East you tend to find people with philosophical and theological education and vision accepting the Christian ruler more or less as he is, and not seeking to change or confront his behavior, but rather seeing him as somehow participating, almost like presiding over a cosmos in which the incarnational faith of the church can be realized as fully as possible. A ruler that will enact legislation to protect the church from heresy, to provide the church with resources to build temples, to do other things that care for the life of the church, but otherwise without expectation that the emperor is changing society to advance the gospel within it as such. If you contrast that with the West, you see that there's a much more reformational spirit that arises with the papacy of the 11th century at the Great Schism and beyond, where popes are more and more pressing on rulers in the West politically to change their behavior, to do things. Sometimes it can be to fight crusades, which is very dubious, but in other cases to do things that are to advance and spiritually improve society and the cosmos. Whereas in the East, the improvement element, the reformational element, is really not there as I see it. It's more of an acceptance that the liturgy is being celebrated, the kingdom of heaven heaven has come to earth through the liturgical sacramental life of the church, and the emperor, the political system, presides over that, but isn't expected to change things and make them better toward a kind of a progress model. Because I think you get our progressive model of an evolutionary state. You get that in the reformational Christianity of the Middle Ages, where there's not a satisfaction with the status quo, but there's a challenge to the status quo, and that blows up in the Protestant Reformation, and then becomes secularized in the so-called Enlightenment.
So it's almost like the emperor or the Caesar is the steward of the kingdom of God on earth. And so as long as he's basically protecting Christianity and allowing it to flourish, accepting all of the other things that he's doing as he's doing them in more like day-to-day political elements is sort of kosher, and that's not really focused on as much.
There's much less, and this to the, I think, discredit of the East, there's much less emphasis on the prophetic role played by church leadership, here we mean bishops mainly, to confront government or to inspire government to do a better job. There's an acceptance that government is broken. There's plenty of examples of Byzantine emperors, Orthodox Christian emperors, poking the eyes out of their adversaries. In one case, a mother pokes the eyes out of her son. So, there's just horrible things going on at the Byzantine court. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible, things like this are going on. Now, Ivan the Terrible was confronted by a metropolitan. His name was Philip, and finally Philip was put to death because he got in the way of Ivan the Terrible's bloodbath. So there are times when there's a prophetic voice spoken, but it's just not as built into the, you might say, the political theology, to use that term that you use, the political theology of the East, the way it is with that Augustinian heritage in the West.
Gotcha. This is a bit of a deviation. For Catholicism, there's the Pope and there's the College of Cardinals and the bishops, which are part of the College of Cardinals, or some of them are. And then the priests, and there's all these, then kind of parallel to that, there's all these religious orders that are non-diocesan. But what's the governing structure of the Orthodox Church or Orthodox churches?
So that governing structure is usually called conciliarism, from the word council, council-based administration of the church, that allows for local, regional, national entities to coalesce into local church bodies, administrative bodies, that are all in communion with each other across the world, but which have distinct so-called autocephalous or self-ruling administrations. And that's a distinct model from what becomes the Roman Catholic model, especially after the Great Schism of papal supremacy, where the Pope is the bishop, the Pope at the top, and all ecclesiastical order, as it were, flows from that single person and his position as the canonical Pope. So in the Orthodox Church, you have regional churches, and this is, the Orthodox Church traces us back to the Scriptures, to Acts chapter 15, where all the apostles come together in Jerusalem to talk about basically a heresy, and that is that all male converts have to be circumcised. And they all agree, no, that's not required, and we're here in council to resolve this, and the Holy Spirit has guided us to reject that requirement. At that council, no single apostle rules the others or exercises some sort of authority over the others. Peter, the first of the apostles, is there, but so is Paul, and so are others, all the apostles. And Peter speaks, he's quoted in Acts 15, but other people speak too. And finally, it's the apostle James, not Peter, but James, who articulates the conciliar resolution of those apostles at this Jerusalem council by saying it seemed good to us, seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us that circumcision not be required. So the Orthodox Church has always followed that conciliar model, where bishops are considered to be equals, and that there is a first among equals. There's a patriarch of Moscow, a patriarch of Constantinople, Bucharest, Romania, and so forth, Antioch, but they don't rule over those bishops underneath them the way the papal model ultimately evolves after the first millennium in the West.
Right. I should probably tell you, I'm Eastern Catholic, so spiritually Orthodox, I guess you would say, and we've retained the right, celebrate the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, but aligned with and in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church. So I kind of sit between two worlds. But I think I mentioned that via email, but maybe helpful for context now. So I sort of know a lot of the things that you're talking about, because it's things that are taught or explained in the Eastern Rite, but it's not always clear because I sort of sit, like I said, between these two worlds. So if we're running low on time, some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the political theology and the rules or the various emphases on Christian statecraft. There's a book, I don't know if you've read it. I have not read it, but I've talked with many people at length and read about this book called The Ancient City, which I think written in the 19th century by Frenchman Fustel de Coulanges. I've heard this argued, or I've heard various interpretations of the argument given in this book. I should probably read it. It's on my list, but the list grows every day. So one argument is that, I think it's the same argument, but two different interpretations of it, is that in the ancient city, religion and politics are fused. There's not even a distinction of two kingdoms, or that the idea that a kingdom could not be of this world. And this is religion is tied to the family, and then the state religion, or the religion of the polis, stems from this ancient practice, which is commonly seen throughout the Middle East, the Greeks, the Romans, of this sort of familiar ancestor worship. And not only is there this ancestor worship, but it's also tribal. And so the practices of warfare, there's this whole paradigm where warfare practice, today we call it international relations, diplomacy. War is, since it's religion, it's gods versus gods, and it's polytheistic. So when one civilization beats another in war, they might sack the temple and take the women and children enslaved, and often, not always, but often killed all of the men. And this would often be seen, like the Melian dialogue during the Peloponnesian War. It was seen as, I think Thucydides maybe saw it as being a violation of natural law or an excess, but this was not something that was uncommon and was sort of accepted as practice. And so one of the things that you're pointing to with the Corinthian massacre by Theodosius is that this is the difference that Christianity makes. It's a totally different paradigm and way of seeing not only the moral, not law, the natural law, but the idea of a Christian versus the idea of a pagan warrior, and what all of that entails. And so my question is, in terms of what the difference Christianity makes, in terms of church-state relations, is it's been argued, or at least been explained to me, that this idea of the ancient city, of the fusion of Christendom, or of the fusion of church and state, even though there's now a distinction in Christianity, that we still have to, the Christianity also ultimately becomes, or Christian cities ultimately become basically one tribe amongst the others. So we have different restraints, morally speaking, but we're not actually different in terms of our, anthropologically, of our religious worship. Does that question make sense? I'm wondering what your assessment of that is.
Yeah. Or cosmologically, I would say that, as I say, that the state, the political system, is part of the cosmos, just like arts are part of the cosmos and other things. And in my book, I'm certainly trying to distinguish between Christianity as such and Christendom. They're not the same thing at all for me. Christendom is influenced by Christianity. But when it comes to Christendom and as a model for the cosmos, yes, there's a fusion of what we would today call church and state. but of course we're aware, and certainly my books are intended to remind people, if they're not aware, that there was the idea of a separation of two distinct things called church and state is absolutely modern and incomprehensible. You mentioned the ancient city, to the ancient world. I mean, that's what Eusebius is saying, that Constantine is an emperor, but he's not like opposed to the bishops. There should be harmony here. And as a matter of fact, the Eastern Christendom had this ideal called symphony. It was called symphonia. It's articulated by Justinian, Emperor Justinian, who, by the way, not only was a powerful Byzantine emperor, he thought of himself as a Roman emperor, but he was also a theologian, and he passed a lot of Christian legislation and such. Well, what Justinian said was there should be a symphony or symphonia, harmony, between the ruler, the person of the emperor, and the bishops of the church, especially, say, in Constantinople's case, the patriarch, that they should work in harmony together, supporting one another, that there shouldn't be legal boundaries defining each against the other. That's a very modern way of thinking. And that modern way of thinking, Tom, comes from the fact that the West goes away from that model. Once it had that model, it had it in the West. I'm not just talking about Byzantium. Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, to use a name that doesn't belong to Charlemagne's time, but more or less describes his empire, blessed by the Pope of Rome. The Holy Roman Empire was, in many ways, modeled on Byzantium and this idea of a fusion of government and religion together. There's no distinction there. No distinction. What happens is the papacy, in its later development, begins to exercise its supremacy over rulers, so that the ruler is distinct from and subordinate to the Pope of Rome. And that becomes a really big deal throughout the so-called Middle Ages. Innocent the Third and others really imposing a strong sense that the Pope is really the ultimate court of appeal and authority over kings and emperors of the West. And so you see this. Boniface VIII's famous Unum Sanctum and so forth further develops this idea. So what the Protestant Reformation is about in some ways, Henry VIII of England, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who gave sanctuary to Luther, is about rebellion against that papal supremacy. And in those Protestant lands now you get a royal supremacy. In the case of Henry VIII of England, he becomes the supreme, there's the word, supreme head of the Church of England, the supreme head of the Church of England, a legal reality that's not lived out anymore, but which still exists for the current now King of England as head of the Anglican Church. So this idea of church and state becomes something dynamic and conflict laden with the development of the papacy and then the reaction to the papacy. And after you get the wars of Western religion between Protestant and Roman Catholic armies in the 30 Years' War, there's so much disgust for government in union with Christianity and the military consequences of that and the death toll that results, that the philosophes of the 18th century say, let's just separate church and state altogether and create constitutional government where the boundaries between government and religious life are more clearly defined. And that is the debate that's going on, has been going on for a long time in the United States now, around the First Amendment, obviously, and this so-called separation or the wall of separation. All those kinds of arguments are being made now about whether religion has a legitimate role to play in the state and in social life. What I would argue is, if we go back in time to try to solve the problems we have today, to the deep past of the First Millennium, we will find some answers there that certainly will find a historical record that will illumine us and help us understand this this problem we seem to face today in our modern or postmodern society, where religion has increasingly no legitimate role to play in our state.
Right. Well, I think that's in many ways clarifying, and it gives me more things to think about. I will finally have to go read this book as I continue to hear more and differing interpretations of its argument, or the argument that at least it makes. You and I will have to pick up this conversation as well at the Honors Conference with hopefully many of our students who will be listening. But until then, I'm very grateful for your time and for coming on to give us a taste of things to come. If people want to look for your work, you mentioned on the side you're doing teaching and writing books. We will plug your 4-volume history of Christendom and of the West in our show notes. But are other things that people can look for to find you?
Well, I do have a podcast. It's called Paradise and Utopia. It was like I call it a scholar's notebook. It was kind of an opportunity for me to research the books and kind of give a presentation about the research as it went underway. So that's out there that can be found. And there's a blog that I haven't been very active with, also at johnstrickland.org. is the address there. So those are that's my platform. That's kind of where I am to be found out there. Yeah. But I think the book series is really the center of it all.
Excellent. Well, I commend them to our readers, and I'll be looking into those things myself. Thank you, Father.
Okay, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.